We were talking about your homes, the homes that you lived in growing up, and you had just started telling us about the sheep camp that you moved to Grandma and Grandpa McCullough, so go ahead.
Now, I might mention, we never ever called it a sheep camp. You're the one who has given it that name, and it describes it pretty well. But it was a white structure, like a small mobile home type thing, but very primitive. There was no bathroom in it. Small, but it came right down to the ground, so it was warm and cozy. And the interior of it, the double bed went across the back end of it, and it just barely fit. And then along the foot of the bed there was a rod that had been put up that are hang-up clothes hung up there, and then a little cloth cover to separate that from the other things, keep the clothes clean. And Mom and Dad, this is Mother and Dad Hargrave, slept in the bed, and there was a little cot, I would guess about that wide, that fit. It had little rollers under it, and you'd put the legs under it, and it would just scoot right under the bed. And that in the daytime, that was hidden away, but at nighttime, they brought it out, put its little legs up, and it was just right to form a little bed for me, and it took up pretty much all the space, the free space in this trailer, and so that's where I slept. And when Dave was born, which he eventually was while we still lived there, Dave slept in the middle of the bed with Mom and Dad, the three of them in the bed and me on the little cot. But there was a table and a window on the one side with little chairs or stools. I don't have a clear memory of the type of chairs, but that's where we ate. On the other side, if any of you remember the black trunk that Mother still had, and we had it downstairs in our Orem home here. We brought it from Manan when she moved in with us, and she kept her baby quilts in it. That sat up on end and was opened up like this, and inside were the diapers and the socks and whatever things that we had, because we had no drawer space to put clothes away. We didn't have very many clothes that all seemed to fit. And then in front of that was a wooden cupboard, and that was where we kept our food, and there was a little counter on the cupboard, the top, and then it came out with a counter, and then drawers at the bottom, or doors. And across from it was a stove, a cook stove, a wood-burning, coal-burning stove, and that filled this little trailer. And that's where we stayed, and I'm sure, I don't have a positive memory of it, but I'm sure we just used the bathroom facilities and the tub and all in Grandma and Grandpa's house, and spent a lot of our time there. Every evening, as it seemed to me, we gathered around the big old round oak table that was Grandma and Grandpa's, and the family played pinochle. And I was too young to play, and I sat at my mother's elbow and watched, and I learned that game. I knew what was a good move and what wasn't, and to this day I cannot play pinochle. I've never had much opportunity, but I didn't remember that game. But that was the way, and probably visiting and talking, because they had radios, but I don't remember it being used a lot. And there was electricity in Grandma and Grandpa's house as compared to Uncle Charlie's farm, where we had just gaslight and candlelight. And so those were happy times with the family, and we lived there. And then,
So dimensionally, that little trailer home, sheep camp as I call it, It was probably maybe 7 feet wide or so if the bed covered the entire width at the end, and maybe 10 to 15 feet long.
Right.
And that was the entirety of, that was where you slept, where you ate, where you, with the stove and all of your clothes for the 3, and then when Dave was born, the 4 of you.
Mm-hmm. And it seemed fine. It seemed fine. Of course, if, well, I was going to say if that's all we'd had and hadn't been by Grandma and Grandpa, it might have seemed more confining, but not really. Aunt Bee got married to Uncle Ralph in 1936, I think. And I don't know how long they lived in a house across town on the southwest side of Rigby, and you could actually look out from their yard and see the Jefferson County Fairgrounds that most of us were familiar with because we had some McCullough family reunions there. But in time, and I don't remember what grade I was in then, we moved our little trailer over next to Aunt Bee and Uncle Ralph. I don't think we owned any property. I don't think the property belonged to anybody beyond their house and yard. It was kind of a rocky place. And I don't remember it, but I'm guessing we must have had an outhouse there because I don't remember going into Aunt Bee and Uncle Ralph's house to use their facilities. So I think we just used an outhouse. And from there, we, Uncle or Grandpa McCullough had a brother, Uncle Tom, who had never married.
So you moved that house, that little trailer sheep camp, to
over across town to be next to Aunt Bee.
Okay.
And I remember Betty, she was 3 years older than I, but we would play marbles. And it was a serious marble game because if you won the marble, you kept it. We each had a big bag of marbles and the ownership went back and forth. And in the summertime, there was an irrigation ditch that at the deepest hole only came up chest high, and there was a little bridge across it. And we used to play, I can't say swim, but we would splash and play in that water and then stretch out with the towel and lie on the bridge and get sunburned. Betty was albino, and her skin did not have any pigment in it to brown. And so she did it right along with me, and she blistered. I don't know how she survived. And then for entertainment sometimes is, if you're familiar with sunburns, bad sunburns, they start to get better and your skin peels, the burned part peels off. And we would lie there on our tummies and peel the dead skin off each other's back, which sounds kind of gross, but it's one of my memories. And then, to go back, Uncle Tom, Grandpa's brother, died, and he owned a piece of property on, I can't remember which street it was. I think it was 2nd South. I think our address became 142 West 2nd South in Rigby. And when he died, we were able to buy from the city or the county, because I think he died intestate. He didn't leave. He had nothing, so he didn't have a will. But we were able to buy his piece of property, and it seems to me it was like $200 or $300 that we paid, something very reasonable that we paid for that piece of property. And we moved the little white trailer over onto one corner of that piece of property that we had bought. Uncle Tom lived in a little shack, and it really was just a little shack. We moved it back to the very far corner of that property and used it as a tool shed, whatever extra things you needed a place to store. It was back there, and when you see that, you wonder how could a man live in such a little place and no plumbing. But then Dad and Uncle Pete, he was one of Aunt Bee's former husbands. She had a total of 5 husbands in her lifetime, but I remember Uncle Pete very well. No children were fathered by him, but he was a wonderful, kind, sweet man, and he and Dad were good friends. And they went up to Island Park up near Yellowstone and stayed during the week and felled trees and skinned them off, cut the branches, and hauled them down to Rigby. And Uncle Pete helped Dad build our home. And that home is still standing. It was originally a log home, and they stretched single strings of barbed wire in between each log and then cemented it to make it airtight. And then we lived in the little trailer house on that property until that house was built, and then we moved into that home. It didn't immediately have a bathroom, but a working bathroom, but the bathroom was built in, the space for it, the room, and in time, actually it was mostly Mother who dug the trench from the house back to the alley to hook onto the sewer, and then we had a bathroom in that house. And we had electricity, and we still had a wood-burning, coal-burning stove. It was possibly the same one we'd had in the trailer, I don't remember. That would be my guess. And a nice, what would you call it, a little stove that was meant just for heat, with the little isinglass windows that you could see through. And that was our heat in the living room. And there was a kitchen and a bathroom and one big room in the house. It was a big room because it was a nice sized house. But that was our all-purpose room. There were 2 beds on each side of the front door, one for Mom and Dad and one for Dave and I. And Dave slept with me, and I slept in those beds in the same room with my parents until I was a sophomore in high school. And then Dad...
So how old were you when you moved in?
I was probably in 4th grade, 4th or 5th grade. I can't remember. I was still in elementary school when the house was finally finished so that we could move into it. And as I said, Dad Hargrave was a kind man, lots of friends, everybody loved him, but he became alcoholic. And he worked, he had bought a water well drilling machine, and he had a partner, and they would go out into the desert areas and drill water wells for people. So he had potentially good income, but we never saw much of it. It just got frittered away by him. And so Mother always worked, and took care of the needs. Mother sewed all of my clothes. I suppose she bought shoes and underpants, and I got a permanent every year, so I always had this tight curly hair that I didn't always appreciate, but I much preferred to what it would have looked like, straight and straggly, but she always wanted me to look well. And I was always a good student because my mother must have instilled in me a love of learning. I think I told you earlier how I tried so hard in 1st grade and felt like I wasn't quite as smooth a reader as some other little girl in the class, but that when I got to 2nd grade, I was the teacher's pet in 2nd grade, and considered probably the top student in that, which doesn't say a lot because it was a little small town, but I did well. And so I went through the Rigby school system. And when I was a sophomore, the spring of my sophomore year in high school, things got bad for Mother in our home because of an alcoholic husband. And I was the one who encouraged her to leave him, and so she did. She and David and I moved just a block or two away on First South in Rigby, where Aunt Dora and Uncle Bill were renting a home. They later built a home in on that same property there, the first home they had. But we moved in with them. They had a little spare bedroom at the back of the house with one double bed in it, and the three of us moved in and slept in that bed until Grandma and Grandpa by then had moved to California. A lot of my mother's brothers and sisters, both, well, sisters, not really brothers at that time, had moved to Southern California, to the Los Angeles area, and they had encouraged Grandma and Grandpa to come out and live with them, and so they were all living in California, but they still owned their home on First North, the Rock home. And when we moved to Aunt Dora's, it's because the Rock home was rented, but the renters left in a couple of months, and we moved across town to the Rock home, and that was a lovely home for us, and just so special because it was Grandma and Grandpa's home. And Don, Mother's youngest brother, and Jimmy, my oldest cousin, one of my oldest cousins, Aunt Belle's son, came back from the army. Jimmy had been in the army, and Don had been in the Navy during the Second World War, and they came back, and they did not want to live with their parents. Grandpa had passed away, but Grandma was still in the Los Angeles area, and Aunt Belle and Uncle Virgil had bought a dairy farm in Grants Pass, Oregon, and they didn't want to live either of those places. They wanted to be back home in Rigby, and so they moved in with us, and it was fun. I had an instant two older brothers that guarded over me, taught me to jitterbug, played with me, and made sure that if I dated anybody, it was somebody they approved. They watched over me like a hawk, and those were happy times. At one point in my senior year, Alan, who was ever the wanderer in my mother's family, Alan came home and lived with us a couple of months and then left again. So those were happy times, and that's where we lived until I got married. Now, did you want me to go forward with other?
So you were married in that Rock house?
I was married. My wedding picture is in the living room of that Rock house. I was married there. And to just...
On the home, when did Grandma Davy move back into the log home?
Well, it took a while for the divorce to become final. And I don't know why. Maybe she waited a while after she separated us from the home, but eventually she pursued the divorce. And in the divorce decree, she was given the home, and Dad was given the bank account, which wasn't large, but he wanted the cash, and Mother wanted the home. And Mother did not fight for everything. She was just such a fair and good person. And interestingly enough, he retained possession of the little sheep camp trailer home and bought the piece of property right next, just east of our home, and moved that there. And so he lived, and she moved back there. It was after I was married that she and Dave moved back into that home. And Dad Hargrave lived next door to them, but he would walk across once in a while when I came to visit and just say, hi, how are you doing? But he never was aggressive or a problem. He accepted the divorce, and I think knew that that was what had to be, and maintained a relationship with Davy and somewhat with me, but I was gone from the home then. But that's when she moved back there, so
I remember visiting with Grandpa Hargrave
uh-huh,
in that little sheep camp next door. There's a big tree,
right.
you know, that gave it shade. I remember that.
And he lived there probably until he died. I was married then. I didn't keep very close track of him, but he had money. He had a sister who was basically an old maid. She got married for a very, very short time and it didn't work out, but she was a school teacher. And he came from the Hargraves were very, very respected people, but he was the black sheep of the family. But Aunt Bernice Hargrave, I knew her well, and I knew my grandparents, Grandma and Grandpa Hargrave, quite well. They lived in Rexburg, and then when Grandpa Hargrave died, Grandma Hargrave moved to Boise, is where Aunt Bernice lived and taught school. But when she died, she willed whatever she had to Dad, to her brother, because she had another sister and brother, but they were doing well, and Dad was the one she felt needed some financial system. So he came into a fair amount of money, and I don't remember whether he at the time or later passed some of that on to Dave, but Dave, when he was in college, took the money that he had inherited from his father, maybe it was when his father died, that he went on his trip to Europe and toured all through Europe, and he was an architecture major, and it was such a wonderful trip for him to visit all those beautiful structures through Europe, and that was a legacy that he received from Dad Hargrave, and I was always grateful for that. It meant a lot to Dave. But one more thing, in high school,